All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation with Dr. Meredith Oda. Tonight's presentation is being presented by the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California and the National Japanese American Historical Society. My name is Paul Osaki, and I am the Executive Director of the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, or what we call the Center. And I'll be acting as your host this evening. Before I begin, I wanted to just briefly introduce you to a new program that will be coming soon. And the program is called J-Talks. And what J-Talks is like a Japanese American talk show. J-Talks will be an entertaining, thought-provoking community platform for Japanese American influencers, educators, creative thinkers, athletes, professionals, leaders, celebrities, entertainers, and people with visionary, creative, inspirational thoughts that may be way out there. But the idea is that we're going to bring together the diversity of the community and have a dialogue and interviews. It's really to showcase the breadth of the Japanese American community beyond just the San Francisco Japanese community. And through the magic of the internet and online, we'll be able to interview people really from Los Angeles to New York and even Japan. Not everyone's going to be what we would call necessarily famous. Some of them will be people from our community that we see every day, but we really don't know much about them, who they are, why they're involved, and their history. And so we hope this to be a really entertaining program that will be coming to you soon, probably sometime in the next couple of months or so. As you know, we've been closed 417 days before we'll open on May 3rd. So we're really excited about that. Tonight's program is with Dr. Meredith Oda, and how this came about was I was searching the internet, and I can't remember what I was looking for, but then this book popped up called The Gateway to the Pacific, and I didn't really know what it was about. But what I saw was a picture of the Japantown Peace Plaza on it. And so I bought the book, I started reading it, and I became fascinated because it was one of the first books that kind of documented our history from the beginning all the way through redevelopment. We talk a lot about the redevelopment of Japantown and the impact and the starting of the Japan Cultural and Trade Center, but it's not documented anywhere. It's kind of in our thoughts who went through this experience, but not well documented. And so I became fascinated with this book, and I tracked Meredith down, and I was just enthralled with all the information that she had in there. And I thought to myself, wow, I don't even know anything about this book. And when I went into the acknowledgement, she acknowledges about 30 or 40 people from the community, but not me. So that's why I didn't know anything about it. But when I talked to her, there had never really been a presentation for her or a platform from her to talk about this book. And so that's really what tonight is about. Okay. And so if we could bring Meredith on, I just have a couple of questions before we get into tonight's presentation. And Meredith, I see that you're from Pennsylvania. There's not a lot of Japanese from Pennsylvania, or not much of a Japantown. So give us a little bit about your background and how you came out here to San Francisco.
First, let me just say, if I ever got this reprinted, I would rectify that and make sure you're there in the acknowledgement.
Oh, it'd be a much better book.
Yeah, much stronger. Well, thank you so much for having me out. And so, yeah, I'm from Philadelphia. I saw that my mom's here. So my parents are here watching too, from Walnut Creek. So I'm from Philadelphia because my dad has worked for the EPA. And so he got a job out in Philadelphia, and so that's where I grew up. And yeah, it was, as far as I know, it was just us. It was suburban Philadelphia, and it was one of the two Asian Americans in the whole school, as far as I know. So,
why did you write this book? I mean, if you didn't come from a Japantown, or you had much history or knowledge about it. Why did you write this book? What motivated you to write this book? And then talk to us about your presentation tonight.
Yeah, so I wrote this book because I worked in Japantown. I worked at Ninja, so I'm so excited that they're the co-sponsor tonight because yeah, I worked there for a couple of years after I graduated college. I interned, I think, there beforehand, and then worked there for a couple of years. It was my first post-college job, so I was in Japantown a lot, and I, so when I was there, it looks much like it does today. And I knew, so I took a lot of Asian American studies classes back in college. And so I also knew it was, it had been an ethnic enclave, really an ethnic ghetto, for racialized ghetto for much of its history. So I just wondered, like, how did we get from there, from, a racialized segregated ghetto to the modernist mall, an adjacent neighborhood that we have today, where there's very few Japanese Americans still living. And also while I was at Ninjas, there was, Shizue Siegel was the editor of the Ninja's newsletter magazine, and she did a two-part series, this fantastic two-part series on redevelopment in Japantown, and I kind of just wanted to know more about it. And when I went to grad school, I got very interested in urban history. So, but most of that literature is at least at the time, was very much about sort of Black-white race relations. So I was just wondering, like, what would it look like? Or we have an example of a case of redevelopment that was completely outside of the usual framework. So what did that look like? How did that work?
Okay. Everybody, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Meredith Oda and her book, which is The Gateway to the Pacific. There you go, Meredith. All on you now.
Okay, great. Thanks. I will share my screen. I have some, hopefully it's just kind of nice pictures. Okay. Oh, at the very end. Okay, and so first I just want to start by thanking Paul and Haruka for organizing this talk. Also, Diane Matsuda had reached out to me months ago. And then of course, thanks to all of you for overcoming what I know is real Zoom fatigue at the end of a year of pandemic. So I'm going to be talking about one facet of the book, really, the burgeoning urban relations between San Francisco and Japan during the late 1950s, and some of the consequences of that. And so, as I just mentioned, I came to this project because I was very familiar with Japantown, and I had a lot of questions about it. And so my project essentially came about like most historians come to their work, which is just questions about the spaces and people around me. And so this really began as this really tiny micro study of Japantown. Kind of, it originated out of just like, how did the Japanese Center get there? But as I researched, it quickly became this bigger and bigger project, thematically, but also geographically. And as I researched, I really came to understand that I needed to look much wider than I had originally done. And I needed to understand US-Japanese relations, decolonization in the Pacific, Japanese domestic retail regulations, Chinese refugee migration to San Francisco, the Black freedom struggle in the US West, which I'll talk about, I guess, a little more in my next talk next month. As well as, post-war urban policy and of course, Japanese American history, to really understand why and how the neighborhood changed the way it did. So it began as, a story of some of the blocks that I walked around in after college, but it became the story of a city collectively, if by no means cooperatively, redefining its place in a global economy and politics, and transforming its buildings, its streets, its homes, and its civic identity in order to do so. So I argue in this book that the city's relationship to the Pacific region, and especially to Japan in the 1950s and 60s, helped to recreate the city's civic identity and built environment. and leading us to, the Japantown that we see today. And we can see this in many ways. Shifts among city leadership, new municipal institutions, expanded employment opportunities, as well as, of course, transformations in the city's built environment, such as the building of the Japanese, at the time it was called the Japanese Cultural and Trade Center. And together, all of these projects and institutions and events and activities help to create what I called a sort of new way of life, a new civic identity for San Francisco that helped to contextualize and facilitate the city's economic and political connections with Japan and the Pacific region by couching it in historical precedent and popular support. So today, I know I'm talking in the series on Japantown history, but I'm actually going to be spending most of my time tonight outside of Japantown because, as I realized, in order to understand why the neighborhood changed the way it did, we have to understand kind of the ways in which the city itself was changing in the post-war period, particularly the 1950s. So that's where I'm going to start. And actually, I'm going to start in Japan itself, because really the first thing to start with, or to kind of just to situate us, is to look at Japan's, what Time magazine called Japan's phenomenal recovery. And another quote, or it also said that the Japanese economy was bursting at the seams. And this is from an article in 1955, which is quite startling, right, in and of itself. So 1955, right? We're barely 10 years out of the Pacific War, of World War II, which had left Japan devastated, right? Its economy, much of its landscape was in total ruins. People were on the brink of starvation, if not literally starving. But Japan's politicians' single-minded focus on economic recovery, and aided by first the US occupation, then outright aid, and support for Japanese textile and military industries, helped to kick off very rapidly what would become decades of economic growth, right? A rate unrivaled by any other country in the world. To the point where, by the 1980s and 1990s, Japan was the US's foremost economic rival. That's decades in the future, but even by the mid-1950s, again, Japan's startling growth was evident to observers. So that, though, was very clear to those in San Francisco. So San Francisco is very aware of Japan's promising recovery, perhaps more than in other parts, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, certainly in the country, because the city had long considered itself, its motto since the turn of the century had been the gateway to the Pacific. San Francisco, the gateway to the Pacific. So the news about Japan's economic growth was really directly meaningful to San Francisco, especially to those in the business community who were concerned with Pacific trade, in a not unsmall portion, right? San Francisco was, after all, a port city. And as the World Trade Authority estimated, foreign trade accounted for about 40 to 60 cents of every income dollar in the city in the early 1950s. And Japan had long been one of San Francisco's major trading partners. Through most of the 20th century, it was second only to Great Britain in terms of foreign trade. And at times it was the primary trading partner. And that's true even through the 1930s, right? When political relations between the United States and Japan were deteriorating rapidly. So long-standing trade history, and in the early, through a lot of that period, much of Japan's industrial needs came directly through San Francisco's ports. And a lot of the economic materials that helped to power that post-war economic growth in Japan came directly through San Francisco's ports. So cotton from the Central Valley went through San Francisco to be loomed on in Japanese textile factories. Resources from the West helped to fuel the military industries of Japan. So San Franciscans then had high hopes that Japan's prosperity would kind of help raise the city up along with it, raise San Francisco along with it, right? San Francisco could ride Japan's coattails. However, and right, there's always a however. Oh, sorry. So as two Chamber of Commerce sort of observers noted, right, growth in this part of the world means growth in ours. And this is a San Francisco representative in Japan on a visit, right, sort of tying the San Francisco's economic future to that of Japan. Okay, so, but however, right, because there's always a however, San Francisco's hold on Japanese trade was by no means guaranteed, right? Despite this long history of very close trade relations, there were still two elemental detriments. So the first was economic. So San Francisco had been, right, the primary coast port on the West Coast in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, but its place by the 1950s was long overshadowed by other coastal rivals, right? Particularly LA, right? LA had exploded in the early 20th century, and by 1920 had outpaced San Francisco in population, manufacturing, commerce, and transportation. Right, and even cities like Seattle or San Diego or Oakland, even right across the bay, these cities too were had gone through their own sort of explosive periods of growth, particularly from World War II, right, and all the federal monies that had helped shore up ports and military installations and shipbuilding, right, all up and down the West Coast. So San Francisco, right, wasn't alone in looking to Japan for an economic future. And they didn't necessarily have a leg up on any of these other West Coast rivals. Further, San Francisco is tripped up by its long anti-Japanese history, right? So, and when I tell this to students or sort of other popular audiences, this can sort of elicit a little bit of surprise, right? Because we now think about San Francisco as being this premier liberal city, right? But really, through much of its history, certainly through much of the 19th and early 20th, or most of the 20th century, that was the exact opposite, right? The city had been the hub of the anti-Asian movement since the late 19th century. What can we say? San Francisco's hated Asians. Asians were by far the most segregated population in the city, far more so than African Americans up through World War II. And for Japanese, this meant segregation in the Western Addition, where we would be, you know, were it not for the pandemic. And you can see this in the ad, right, or the article right here. The Japs have invaded the Western Addition. Obviously, this is not a particularly positive view of that development. So through World War II, Asian Americans, Japanese Americans among them, were arguably at the very bottom of the racial hierarchy on the West Coast, and certainly in San Francisco. And this was a recent history that not only were San Franciscans aware of, but also Japanese people, ordinary people in Japan would have been aware of too. So an education segregation movement in 1906 in San Francisco set off an international incident that had some Japanese people calling for war with the United States. That's what this poster references here. Of course, the World War II internment had been planned out of the West Coast Command at the Presidio, and San Francisco had been the embarkation point for the Pacific Theater for US troops. So San Francisco then had this very long and storied history of anti-Japanese sentiment that would hinder, right, its efforts to reach out and forge these new bonds with Japan. So that was kind of the question for business leaders, right? How to make their city. They desired all these Japanese economic ties. How could they make their city attractive to their desired Japanese economic and political relations? How could they attract these Japanese partners? So they tried a few ways. So first, standard, this is the business community we're talking about. They look to cultivate business ties. And so at first they worked really hard to sort of strengthen and expand pre-existing and new economic connections with Japan. So they did things like revive the San Francisco chapter of the Japan Society, which was more or less officiated by by business leaders in San Francisco. The Port of San Francisco undertook a whole program of trade promotion, including setting up promotional offices in Tokyo and in other Asian countries. The World Trade Association formed the Japanese Affairs Subcommittee in 1956, which was really one of only two subcommittees formed in that decade in order to, monitor Japanese economic conditions and provide a clearinghouse for business, but only 2 subcommittees that the association created. And then finally, it also undertook what became an annual business tour of Asia, claiming to be, or actually the Japanese Times, the Japan Times claimed to be this tour to be the first US Chamber of Commerce contingent to travel to post-war Japan. And this was a pretty ambitious tour. It was 25 days, almost a month. And it would start at the Japan International Trade Fair, where they would, and then travel all over the country, right? Meeting with government officials, business executives, touring factories, seeing resource acquisitions, and with almost all of this Asian tour happening in Japan, with some stops in Hong Kong and the Philippines. So all about kind of learning about market conditions in Japan, and of course, also promoting San Francisco. And on that tour was another kind of effort or strategy to promote San Francisco in Japan, which was the creation of the sister city relationship with Osaka, of course, now defunct for a few years, actually. 2018 is when it ended. But among the efforts then to kind of undertaken by the San Francisco business community was the sister city relationship with Osaka, formed in 1957. And at this point too, the whole sister city thing was very new. Right now it's kind of rote and routine, and every city has a bunch of sister cities. But at the time, this had actually just begun in 1956. So this was a brand new program. And of course, it's a Cold War program. So it's part of the People to People initiative developed by President Eisenhower to forge links between ordinary Americans and other parts of the world on this grassroots level, right? Win hearts and minds all over the world, and of course, lure them away from the Soviet Union. So business leaders then took advantage of this affiliation to form a relationship with Osaka, which in particular made sense. Osaka was the Manchester of the Orient, the nation's leading industrial city and a top port as well. Much of San Francisco's major exports, supply machinery, cotton, went straight to Osaka factories. And Osaka too was interested in cultivating international trade. So in this period, a lot of what powered Japanese economic growth was foreign trade and foreign business. So Japan, the nation, was heavily dependent on foreign ties, and Osaka as the manufacturing center was particularly so. So for a city looking to cultivate business ties with Japan, then Osaka was the city that made sense for San Francisco to be interested in. Okay, so they formed the sister city relationship. And for the first year, it's pretty much entirely led, actually even monopolized by businessmen. And of course, it was all men. So it was led by people like Lester Goodman, for example, the president of Getz Brothers, an export company, and similar sort of executives or board members of businesses like the Metropolitan Insurance Company, US Customs, San Francisco Port Authority, the Fairmont Hotel, American President Lines, all bodies that either provided financial services for or oversaw or conducted trans-Pacific commerce. So the first year then was almost entirely monopolized by this sort of cohort of businessmen. And really it was, economic business or economic boosterism, right? It wasn't really civic engagement. And to a degree, it really worked for their purposes, right? When they went on these annual business tours, they were a privileged group as a result of being the sister city of this manufacturing center, right? The affiliation opened doors for these business people for municipal governments, to executive suites, to factory floors. So it did function as this very kind of efficient foundation for business ties with this important manufacturing center, and also around in other parts of Japan as well. However, Goodman and these other business leaders soon found that there are real limitations, even obstacles, when the city's sister relationship affiliation relied solely on business people for support. And we can see this if we look at the opening ceremony for the affiliation, pictured here in Osaka. So in Osaka, then, this affiliation was celebrated. It was accepted happily by Osaka, and it was celebrated with this whole day-long set of festivities. There's a parade, there's a ceremony at the municipal center. All the municipal leaders were in attendance. Osaka, just ordinary Osakans attended, or else attended the parade or the other events. All of which kind of suggested, right, that Osaka leaders respected and were attentive to this new affiliation, right? But on the other hand, it was pretty much completely unmatched by San Francisco municipal officials, right, who had almost no hand in the development of this affiliation. The mayor, and was Mayor George Christopher at the time, he basically signed off on the official request letter, and that was kind of all that he did for the affiliation. And so this sort of inattention ended up being dismissive, even rude, in this early stage. So, for example, for this ceremony, the mayor of Osaka, Mitsuji Nakai, requested from Mayor George Christopher a letter of commendation, just to read at the ceremony, right, acknowledge San Francisco's role in this. And he just had to hound Christopher to get this letter. He sent several telegrams, right, just asking for just this letter to read. And so finally, when Christopher got around to sending it, it was not at all what Nakai had in mind. Instead of sort of celebrating this equitable sort of fictive kinship between the two cities, he very condescendingly described the new affiliation, not as this kinship of equals, but as, in his words, an adoption of Osaka by San Francisco, right? So that the citizens of San Francisco could encourage the economic and cultural progress of Osaka, right? So a very sort of tutelary or condescending and kind of infantilizing portrayal of, again, what is supposed to be this equitable relationship. And further, of course, while the Osaka mayor, this is happening in Osaka, so of course the Osaka mayor is there, Christopher didn't go, and that's not totally surprising. It's a very long distance, very expensive, but he also didn't bother to even send or sort of delegate a representative for San Francisco, which he could have easily done, because there was dozens, if not scores, of San Francisco businessmen living in Osaka or the region, who could have, easily stepped in as the representative for San Francisco, and he didn't even bother to do that. Until finally, prodded again by Nakai, Osaka agreed, to foot the bill for whoever that they sent, whoever was the delegate. And then even worse, San Francisco didn't get around to sending a commemorative gift. So Osaka presented this lovely gavel to San Francisco. San Francisco had nothing, didn't bother to come up with a gift. So, and this was bad, right? As you can imagine, the US State Department, who watched over these early sister city relationships very closely, despaired at this near disaster, which could lead very directly to kind of harsh feelings on the part of Osaka, right? As the consular official described, San Francisco didn't seem to be very well prepared, and there was disappointment in Osaka at their level of participation. All right, so this just relying then on business, not reaching out to municipal community, much less the popular community, then sort of created a rocky start for the affiliation, one that could easily inhibit the founders' goals for creating this close, continuing relationship between Japan and San Francisco. All right, so again, San Francisco, this business community then had to, was still faced with this question then: how can we make sure that our city is desirable to these desired relationships? And the answer became then to invest all of San Franciscans in kind of all things Japanese, right? City officials, the business community, of course, but also city officials and the general population. So bringing in the rest of San Francisco to its cause. And here, again, there was a lot of kind of stumbling blocks. So there were these and many negative popular views of Japan, right? So, 1955, 1957, we're just barely 10 years out of the war. And San Francisco, again, had been the embarkation point, right? This is a San Francisco Gibraltar of the West. And here is a naval ship that had been, was steaming back into San Francisco Bay after being involved in a naval battle with San Francisco. So there's all these kind of negative views of Japan. Also, San Francisco at the time, a very sort of Italian and Irish city, beautiful, cosmopolitan, sophisticated. And Chinatown is, of course, is world renowned by this point. But certainly there was no kind of analogous, nationally recognized Japanese counterpart to Chinatown. Maybe the Japanese tea garden, but Japantown was often, or Japanese town as its residents called it, wasn't even represented on most maps usually. Okay, so unpopular views of Japan, San Francisco, kind of about Japan more broadly. And then also, this is partly about forging these ties with Japanese industry. There's also the problem that Japanese products, as the Chronicle called it, were always cheap and sometimes shoddy, right? This is the 1950s or so. So popular views of Japanese goods, right? This is before Nikon cameras. This is before the Honda. So popular views of Japanese products are still that they're kind of cheap, right? They're imitative. They're good value, but they're probably going to break pretty quickly. So there's very little kind of to really, by the early 1950s, by the mid 1950s, then most Americans, and certainly most San Franciscans too, are just not ready, right, to see Japan as an equal partner, as worthy of respect. Right, and as we saw at the opening ceremony for the sister city affiliation, then that could lead directly to problems. All right, so the sister city affiliation then kind of helped in this regard. So the sister city, it kind of came to the rescue. And so this is a flyer for one of the earliest events of the sister city affiliation. Following, there was a small private reception for the mayor when he was visiting the United States. And this is kind of characteristic of some of the affiliation events of the first year, private, small, for a invitation only crowd, often, municipal government officials or the San Francisco business community. And that's fairly distinct among sister city events of the time, certainly as we think of them now. But, Seattle, LA, San Jose, they were all affiliating with Japanese cities too. And their events were big and public and, popular, meant to attract a mass crowd. But these were, the opposite, kind of small, invitation only. But they still served a purpose. So the events like this and others introduced Osakan figures to San Francisco leadership most likely to interact with Japanese partners. So in this case, it's Michisu Sugi. He's the president of the Osaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and kind of one of the foremost leaders of Japan industry, not only in Osaka, but around the world. Around the country. So, events like this then introduce San Franciscans to, they introduce figures such as this to members of the San Francisco government who might have to correspond with Osakan counterparts, introduce the leaders of civic groups like the International Hospitality Center or the Asia Foundation, who again might work with Osakan or Japanese counterparts, as well as more members of the Chamber of Commerce or trade associations. All right, so while limited then, these are, again, small, not that many people are going to know about it. They're not heavily publicized either. Nonetheless, these events like this help to do a couple of things. So first, again, they're introducing San Francisco business and municipal leadership to Japanese men whose status commands respect, and helps to challenge these kind of popular stereotypes. These are Japanese businessmen, highly competent, highly regarded in their field, and help to contrast, right, with the sort of shoddy popular views of Japan in the media. And second, these visitors, like Suki, were in turn assured of their welcome and prestige in San Francisco, right? They get to be feted by San Francisco leadership. And so we're able to witness firsthand the municipal support for Japanese partnerships. And the civic nature of the Sister City program also afforded the opportunity to recast Japan as a whole more broadly for ordinary San Franciscans too. So after the kind of year of these small invitation-only business events, the Sister City affiliation began branching out into sort of larger, more popular, more public activities. And many of these, for the first couple of years, featured the Japanese Self-Defense Force, as the reconstituted Japanese armed forces were known. So San Francisco's first post-war public encounter with the Japanese armed forces then was during the city's inaugural Pacific Festival in the fall of 1958. The festival went on to be held yearly for years. And it was a 10-day festival that celebrated countries all over the Pacific Rim, but heavily featured, of course, Osaka and all of Japan. The guests of honor were really this visiting naval squadron and its crew. And of course, the squadron could have been a potent reminder of Japan's former enmity, right? But the activities of both the Japanese servicemen and San Franciscans helped to paint this much more friendly picture. So the Japanese sailors gave a martial arts demonstration in Union Square. They attended USO dances. And the kind of culminating event was this open house on board the destroyers and the frigates to San Franciscans to come on board, and the Japanese sailors, met them, introduced themselves, took them on tours of the ship, and so helped the ships and their crew to become these very friendly and familiar figures to the over 5,000 San Franciscans who attended, right? Who exhibited what the San Francisco Chronicle called this enthusiastic acceptance of the old enemy. And activities like this continued on for years. In 1960, another naval crew visited San Francisco to celebrate the centennial of US-Japanese relations, and also to celebrate that year's Pacific Festival. And the highlight of their visit is pictured here. Their participation in the culminating parade that went down Market Street and landed in Civic Center. And this was an enormous parade, and the sort of centerpiece of the parade was these naval cadets, 40 of them, who marched dressed up in full costume, as the newspapers called it, dressed in green and blue robes of feudal samurai. Right, and San Franciscans came out in droves to cheer on this spectacle. According to the Chronicle, their performance delighted about 10,000 San Franciscans, who kind of crowded along the entire parade route to see this spectacle. And to cheer it on, right? There was no accounts of hostility or boos or hisses. This was very much a kind of celebration of Japan. So through these kinds of parades, through these kinds of visits, the affiliation, the San Francisco-Osaka affiliation, helped to revise the wartime enemy and present Japan as a formidable yet friendly and approachable, respectable ally. Okay, I'm going to skip that because I think we're running out of time. But so the San Francisco affiliation then was very popular. It involved, as we can see at these parades, thousands and thousands of San Franciscans. But it was only one of many links in San Francisco that sort of connected the city to Japanese culture or Japan directly. So among those two was among the most popular representations of Japan in the city through the 1950s and even into the 60s were Sukiyaki restaurants. So this dish was all the rage across the country in the 1950s and 1960s. I was doing a little research on it for a sort of separate article, and I found recipes for sukiyaki in monthly magazines, national magazines like Time or Life or Good Housekeeping, as well as in like tiny dailies, like in Paris, Texas, or in Wichita, Kansas, with recipes, how to host your own sukiyaki party. So the dish was all the rage in this period, but San Francisco is one of the few cities that hosted so many sukiyaki restaurants, and it had so many. Of course, there had, Japanese restaurants had been around for decades, right, serving the migrant community, but they had never really reached a mainstream non-ethnic audience until the 1950s, when there was a post-war boom in Japanese sukiyaki and tea houses. And so here's a picture of Tokyo sukiyaki, one of the biggest. There's Yamato, I can't remember it now. But there's 3 kind of really big ones, but then there's dozens of smaller sukiyaki restaurants too. This one is on Fisherman's Wharf. There's another one in this downtown area. And all of these restaurants kind of outdid each other in this kind of like cultural arms race to kind of out Japanese each other, right? So they imported decor from Japan, right? Borrowed architectural features and design for the interiors to make it sort of heighten the experience. All of them featured waitresses in kimono, as you can see here. Many had floor seating, so you could really kind of like dine in and feel like you're getting a Japanese experience. This one had private rooms. Others had interior landscaping. I mean, these were really big kind of sort of spectacles to give patrons not only, the food, the popular dish, but also this whole sense, right, that they're in this entire Japanese kind of environment. And aside from these restaurants, there was also a number of art exhibits featuring Japanese art, cultural shows. The YMCA at one point sponsored house tours of kind of Japanese inspired homes. Some landscaped their gardens in a more Japanese style. And so there's this whole host of kind of individual and organizational efforts that, of course, reflect a national trend. There was a bit of a, sort of Japanese craze, I guess, in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. But it also, of course, indicated a local affinity, right? Rooted San Francisco kind of particularly in this kind of linkage or set of ties, networks with Japan. So clearly then, there were a number of ways, right, in which we can find this kind of fascination with Japan in San Francisco, as well as heightened connections to the nation. And of course, some of these are casual, informal ties, right? You can go out and have a sukiyaki dinner on your weekend. But these also help to usher in more systemic changes in the city. So we can see this, for example, through the many trips to Japan that the mayors, starting from Mayor George Christopher onwards, began to take under the framework of the sister city affiliation to Japan over the years. So Mayor Christopher himself, this is his tour in 1959. He went again in 1963 and 1964. His successors, Mayor Jack Shelley and Joseph Alioto, similarly took tours. And these were often the only international tours that a mayor might make. Christopher also went to Greece, but that was, he's of Greek descent. So that was also kind of like mostly kind of a homeland visiting. But Mayor Jack Shelley, for example, I think his trip to Japan was the only international foray that he took. And of course, these Osaka mayors would, and other mayors would, sort of reciprocate and come back to San Francisco to meet and sort of facilitate more kind of trans-Pacific networks. And these are trips that involve a considerable investment of municipal funding and time, and also then help to shape the kind of institutional life of the cities. So when Mayor Jack Shelley takes office, he has to host a contingent coming in from Osaka. And he doesn't, and he's faced with this kind of list of names and officers that don't really have a parallel in San Francisco. So he doesn't really know what to do, but his administrative assistant is more or less says, oh, no problem, I've got this, and introduces him to, or sort of tells him what all these Japanese municipal roles are and how to interact with them, right? So down to the very kind of staff level then, the municipal government is kind of ready and able and capable of kind of, smoothing relations, facilitating ties, encouraging lasting connections with Japanese counterparts. And that's not only true for city government, but we can also see it in a kind of more citywide commitment to Japan through the example of a 1960 bond. And this helped to fund this enormous collection of Asian art that was proposed to be housed in a wing. A wing had to be built, but a wing in the De Young Memorial Museum. And later on, this collection would become the foundation for the Asian Art Museum, the world-renowned now Asian Art Museum. It was offered to San Francisco by this big Chicago industrialist who made the offer, he said, because as the Western gateway to the Orient, San Francisco would be the most suitable home for it. And so the bond then sort of took off, right? It's this initiative to raise bonds. And it garnered the widest range of enthusiastic endorsements ever accorded a municipal proposition, according to the Chronicle. So everyone from the San Francisco Real Estate Board to a Cooks Union local to every municipal, state, and federal elected official in the city endorsed the measure. And it flew by with this 40-point margin, showing incredible popular support then in San Francisco for their city as not only the top US center for Oriental art, but also the cultural and business gateway to Asia. So the sister city relationship then, and all the cultural and political and economic connections that it helped to foster, as well as all the sort of like-minded or parallel institutions, all helped to really strengthen the city's Japanese links, right? And publicly express their depth to San Franciscans, a US audience, as well as, of course, a Japanese audience. And so this brings us back then to Japantown, because the Japanese Cultural and Trade Center then emerges as kind of the ultimate of San Francisco's commitment to Japan. So in 1960, as part of the city's first redevelopment project, the redevelopment agency added a Japanese Cultural and Trade Center to its plans for the Western Addition redevelopment project. It was proposed as it was built for the longtime Japanese enclave in the city. And it was meant to be this kind of premier center for all things Japanese, for Japanese businesses and goods and capital, and built, as it was, with Japanese investment and companies to institutionalize San Francisco's preeminent place in the Pacific and recognize its status as the major gateway to and from Japan. So the Japanese Center therefore emerged and institutionalized a whole environment of Japanese connections and institutions and materials and ideas throughout San Francisco that all helped to shape the orientation of city government, inform the collections, right, of San Francisco's art museums and the cuisine of its restaurants, brought in Japanese officials, executives, and representatives who mixed with ordinary as well as kind of leaders in the San Francisco community in new ways, while forging new links with places in disparate parts of the Pacific region. So then to conclude then, together, right, the Japanese Center, the Sister City affiliation, all of these projects and institutions and activities that related to Japan and Japanese culture helped to reshape public and municipal life for San Francisco, contextualizing and facilitating the city's economic or political trans-Pacific connections with historical precedent and popular support. So what had begun then as this kind of self-interest of a handful of Pacific-oriented businessmen then became a whole civic identity, the gateway to the Pacific, the motto kind of writ large that would reshape Japantown as well as much of the city's political, economic, and cultural institutions for decades. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing. Oh, Paul, I think you're on mute.
Okay, Meredith, thank you so much. I really appreciate the background and history of your presentation. You know, I wanted to add that I had an opportunity to befriend Mayor Christopher when he was 90 years old.
Whoa. Really?
Actually, I brought him back to Osaka for the 40th anniversary, and it was the first time that he had been back since 1963. In fact, you know, in his will, he left me this, and this
oh my God!
That the mayor of Osaka, Mayor Chuma at that time, gave him on his first visit, and it presented to the Honorable George Christopher, Mayor of San Francisco, the Honorable Mayor of Osaka, Mayor Chuma. So this is really prize and treasure. But yeah, I really had an opportunity to get to know Mayor Christopher in his later years, and so. But my follow-up question is, do you think the sister city with Osaka played a major role with the investment of Kintetsu in the Japan Trade Center, but then also the hotels? Was there a direct tie?
I know, you would think, right? Because they're from Osaka. It's an Osaka-based company. I wasn't able to find like a sort of direct missing link. The guy who went out to get all the investors and the tenant companies for the Japanese center when it was under development was Masayuki Tokioki, this Hawaiian financier from Hawaii. He was Japanese. He was actually a Japanese migrant to Hawaii, but and he went, and then I was never able to find exactly how he got a hold of him. I talked to his son or his sons, and none of them were exactly sure how he tracked anybody down. So, but I do know he went to Osaka kind of with letters of introduction based on the affiliation and from the mayor and everything to Osaka. So I imagine, I was never able to like directly find that smoking gun, but I imagine it did because again, it's sort of the affiliation, one of its roles was to kind of smooth and facilitate these economic interactions. And so it seems like, I mean, I didn't put it in there in my book because I wasn't totally sure, but I think it did because like there's, yes, I think so.
Makes sense somewhere in there, right? I just wanted to add also, you know, although the mayor of Osaka kind of terminated, in his eyes, the sister city relationship. For a lot of us who have been involved with the sister city, as far as we're concerned, he can't do that. You know, Eisenhower set it up as a people-to-people exchange of ideas and cultural values. So, you know, on a government level, maybe yes, but I think on a people-to-people exchange that will continue, and no mayor on either side that relationship. I wanted to turn it over to Hanukkah now to ask you some of the questions that have come up into the chat, and I will go off screen. Thank you, Meredith.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. You guys haven't met me before. I'm Haruka Radovish. I'm the Senior Programs Manager of the JCCNC, or the Center. And I will be reading out loud any of the questions that have come in the chat for Dr. Oda. So actually, we do have our first question from Rod, and he's asking, Dr. Oda, will your next presentation and your book cover Japantown during the 70s?
Yeah, so yes, the next presentation is going to be about kind of Japanese and African-American participation and protest against redevelopment in Japantown. So that'll cover the 60s and into the 70s.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that'll be great. So please do come. I would love to. I mean, so as I mentioned to Paul and Haruka, this is my first talk in well, it's not really in Japantown, but like kind of in Japantown. So I'm really looking forward to now and then to seeing what people who are from San Francisco, from the area, have to say.
Okay, people have requested to see my face as I ask these questions, but if folks have other questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. I do have a question myself for Dr. Oda. You know, a lot of the development of the Japan Trade Center was predicated on the Osaka city relationship that developed, right? But kind of curious, are there other cities or areas of Japan that had ties to Japantown that went into the development?
What do you mean? Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Or, I mean, were there other like cities where there were significant business ties that also contributed to the development of the Japan Trade Center
Oh, other cities in the US or in Japan?
in Japan or in the US actually, yeah, for that matter.
Yeah, well, so Honolulu is an important center just because that's where the financier came from, and it was kind of like he was fostered in conditions that were pretty much only possible in Hawaii, since it was a majority Japanese American, or pluralistic, or you know, the biggest group of any demographic group in Hawaii was Japanese, of Japanese descent. So and for the various reasons, the sort of cultural and social and economic conditions of what was still then the territory, or the very newly minted state at this point, was important. So the financier came from the specific condition of kind of Honolulu. But as far as Japan is concerned, I mean, Tokyo would have been the other one, because some of the other businesses, so Kintetsu is from Osaka, but some of the other businesses that were there are more based in Tokyo. So when the developer for the center went to Japan to kind of track down investors or businesses, or just interest in general, he went, of course, to Osaka, but he also he spent a lot of time in Tokyo too.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we have another question. This is from Hamilton, and he asks, I've always wondered about the architecture of Japantown. Did the mall type structure help or hinder the development of the community?
It's kind of interesting because it did both, I think. So I always think and this was something that I noticed just working there, the architecture of the Japanese Center is kind of gnarly, right? It's like this enormous wall separating one part of the West, and very intentionally separating one part, like sort of, frankly, the black part of the Western addition from Japantown, and then also, the kind of richer, whiter parts of San Francisco when you go up, I guess it'd be go up west, towards Pacific Heights and everything. So in some ways then, I mean, it's meant to kind of disrupt the Western addition and draw a stark line. Of course, the Geary Boulevard was also part of the redevelopment project. That also, is a function of that, or that also does the same thing. But the Japanese Center kind of exacerbates that dynamic. I think that the sort of dividing line that the Geary Boulevard creates between the West. I'm an urbanist, and I'm very like sort of I think spatially, but I can't maneuver in physical space. So I'm trying to think. So like the eastern part of the Western addition from the western part, right? So like little Japantown, Japanese town, it actually was enormous. It had been 20 blocks, many acres, but the Japan Center kind of split it in half. And so more Japanese Americans began to sort of hug the side of the side of Geary that the Japanese Center and what is now Nihonmachi were. So on one hand, it kind of helped to, and of course, it's three huge blocks that used to be Japanese owned, as well as Black owned, Filipino owned, Chinese owned businesses and homes, residential buildings, apartments and so forth. So it literally displaced hundreds of families and homes and households and individuals, often quite low income, who were living in these residential hotels or whatnot. So on the one hand, it helped to, disrupt. And of course, it was on the main commercial artery of Japantown too, post. So it was very disruptive. But on the other hand, later on in subsequent generations, like by the time you get to the 70s, it had kind of been reclaimed by community members so that it became an important cultural institution, right? So when Asian American movement activists looked to kind of revitalize or sort of protect the Japanese town community from redevelopment, it did so by holding activities and events in the Japanese center. Right, they had a big mochizuki festival, for example, like in the Japanese center. So in some ways, it sort of was reclaimed to be a kind of a cultural Japanese American cultural institution.
Sure. Okay, so our next question then is about Japanese Americans that were in San Francisco at the time, and did any JAs play any roles in the establishment of the relationship between Japan and San Francisco?
Yeah, and I just didn't have time for that, but yeah, absolutely. And I think this is part of, so scholars kind of identify the post-war period, particularly this early Cold War period, as the time in which sort of the Asian American model minority is being created, right? From in the pre-war period, Asians were excluded, they're prevented from naturalization. Again, they were segregated in ways that other people of color weren't in California and in San Francisco. But in this post-war period, we start to see a change. And oh crap, what was the question? Sorry, I lost track.
Were there JAs that played a role in establishing the relations between Japan and the US?
Yeah, and so I think in San Francisco in particular, that sort of fascination, interest in Japan helped to kind of open a window for Japanese Americans to kind of act on a municipal or sort of citywide stage and sort of have a value, I guess, to the mainstream city that they didn't have before, right? So that, for example, when that squadron first came and sort of became the centerpiece of that first inaugural Pacific Festival, they actually came because, or they were sort of brought to the attention, their visit was brought to the attention of city government by Japanese Americans, right? Because there's this longstanding tradition of like Japanese squadrons would visit Hawaii or visit California and be hosted by, by Japanese diasporic communities. Picnics and dances and so forth. And so it was Japanese Americans who actually knew about that visit. And so they told the municipal government, oh, this Pacific Festival happens to coincide with this visit. Maybe you can do something with it. Right. And so some of the Japanese American events that they always held, dances or dinners, picnics for the squadron, ended up sort of integrated into the longer schedule of Pacific Festival events, so that what had been once ethnic activities now became kind of San Francisco wide, right? They were sort of mainstreamed because of this interest in Japan and in other ways too. So when the DeYoung had an exhibit of Japanese arts, some of the materials came from Japanese American donors who, had sculpture or had decor in their homes that they donated for display. So in fact, Japanese Americans proved pretty important to kind of fleshing out, right, those bonds. And then of course too, right, as we can see with the building of the Japanese Center in Japantown, just as a kind of diaspora located for so long in San Francisco, right? Much longer than the Japanese American community in LA, right? As this very long-rooted community in San Francisco, they were able to, they were just kind of evidence of this other connection with Japan.
Sure, okay. So this next question, I'm actually gonna combine two questions from Lori and Wes, and I think it might actually tie in with your next lecture with us on May 20th. But Lori asked, what was on the blocks that the Japan Trade Center was built upon? And then Wes asked, where did the Japanese American community fit in the growing relationship between San Francisco and Osaka, given that the eventual effects of redevelopment would disrupt the neighborhood and disregard the community?
I'll start with the first question and then I'll go to the second. I think you're gonna have to repeat it for me.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so on the blocks of the Japanese Center, actually, if I could self-promote a little bit, my book has a list of some of the businesses, because my memory is shot. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head. But there was, I think it was the Aki Hotel. No, not the Aki Hotel. One long-standing Japanese residential hotel, which was like essentially kind of a rooming house that a lot of, Japanese migrants were a big part of the migrant agricultural labor force up and down the West Coast. And so when they would come through San Francisco, they would go to these rooming houses to stay and also to hear about job opportunities elsewhere. So there was one rooming house there. There was, I think it was the Nippon Pool Hall, I think was also located on that strip. What is now the, God, and I've been kind of distant from this book for a little bit, so I'm remembering forgetting all the names. But the hardware store, the one right on Post and Buchanan.
Local hardware.
Soko Hardware, yeah, that used to be located on the Japantown or the Japanese Trade Center block, but he had to move, obviously when he was displaced by the center. The Henri and oh crap, now I can't remember their name either. The Takahashi family, their original store was on the Japanese or the Japan Trade Center block or blocks. And then there was just dozens of homes and residences and apartments. So Masa Ashizawa, the owner of Soko Hardware, his not only was his first business or his storefront was there, but he also owned a home on that block as well. So there was a whole mix of businesses. And of course, there's a lot of Black owned businesses too that were on those blocks because it was a very integrated, or at least multiracial, right, neighborhood.
Sure. Okay. So Wes's question then was, where did the JA community fit into the relationship between San Francisco and Osaka, given that redevelopment would disrupt the Japantown neighborhood and disregard the residents of the community?
Let's see. So to me, those are kind of separate questions. So on the one hand, again, Japanese Americans were part of the affiliation, particularly, once it stopped being the sort of domain of simply sort of the San Francisco business elite and became more popular. So like part of the exchanges were Boy Scouts, and the Japanese Boy Scout troop, forgetting the number now, but the JA Boy Scout troop was one of the exchange groups that would go to visit Japan. And actually less so in San Francisco, but like in Oakland, for example, when they affiliated, and I think that was a little later, maybe 1958 or 59, Oakland affiliated with, I can't remember the city, but that actually affiliation was led by two Japanese Americans, Frank, I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting all these names.
Frank Ogawa?
What's up?
Was it Frank Ogawa?
No, the plaza, Ogawa. Yeah, no, it was, sorry, Frank Ogawa. Yeah, Frank Ogawa and Mas Yonemura. Those two, they're both Oakland residents, and they actually proposed and sort of went headed a contingent, a mayoral contingent to I can't remember the city that Oakland affiliated with, but they led the contingent to propose this affiliation and so in that case, it was actually led by, and I think that was also the case in San Jose. So in other cities that were particularly in which the business community was less kind of monopolizing of the affiliations, Japanese Americans were actually pretty central to the building of these relationships. And I don't know that redevelopment had that much of a hindrance on that, or on their role in it, because it was, the affiliation wasn't so much geographically centered. And so I can't off the top of my head say that there was really any kind of direct effect of redevelopment on their role in sister city affiliations.
Sure. Okay, and just want to be mindful of people's time, so we'll ask two more questions and then we'll close out tonight's program. But also, Dr. Oda, if the question is something that will be more clearly answered in the next lecture, we can certainly save that response for next time as well. But Barbara asked a question, were the displaced people who lived and held businesses in the blocks where the Japan Trade Center was built, were they compensated? And if so, how much and who determined the compensation?
Right, and that was the whole problem with particularly early redevelopment programs, is that there was very little even attention, I think, to the residents of any redevelopment area, right? So in these early programs in particular, it was very much a kind of mass bulldoze the whole area, right? It was very much attuned to this is land that's not generating as much, say, tax revenue as it could. Therefore, we're going to redo it so that we can have much higher priced housing or better, higher rent commercial areas, right? So there was no real attention to, right? So the residents were presumed to, maybe they'll go to public housing, maybe they'll move out of the city, right? There just wasn't that much, even though they officially, all cities had to have some kind of plan for the displaced. There was often very little, there was a lot of wiggle room. And so in this case too, that was very much the case. So the displaced people who lived there and had businesses technically were compensated. They had to be, by the federal regulations that governed these redevelopment programs. But it was determined, of course, by the city, right? The city was the ones who went out and hired the, what did they call it? The people who, price out a building or a property.
Appraisers.
Yeah, they hired the appraisers, or they were just sort of municipal appraisers. They were employees of the government. And the problem was, and this was pointed out by all the Western Addition residents when the program was first proposed, right? That the assessment of these properties were fundamentally flawed because, right, they were based on the costs as they were presumed to stand at that particular point, which made no, in this kind of abstract way, which made no accounting for the fact that these were, these were often properties, homes, businesses that were held by, or that were lived in, occupied by segregated people, right? So the prices were vastly inflated to what they should be, particularly given the inherent value of the building or the structure, right? Because if you are a Black owner, a business owner, or a JA homeowner, and you can't live anywhere else, you are going to be paying inflated rents or inflated prices because your landowner, your property holder knows that you don't have any other option. So rents were in fact quite high. Property value, prices, home prices were really quite high, given what you got, because of these restricted options by these segregated people. And so as a result, but that wasn't factored in, right, when the assessors came. So the compensation was always far lower, one, than what the people had paid, or two, or the rents that they paid, or two, what they could buy with whatever they're given compensation for, right? So family home might be given a certain price, but that price isn't going to allow them to buy elsewhere in the city, right? Even if they could, given that they were segregated. And that was part of what would become this massive resistance to redevelopment by the 1960s, particularly because it was so clear, right, that residents, property owners, business owners in these redeveloped areas were essentially getting shafted, right, displaced, but without adequate compensation.
Sure. All right, so this brings us to our final question of the evening. And so this one is from Lynn, and she's asking, now that you've finished the book Gateway to the Pacific, what else are you currently researching or writing on?
Oh yeah, and I'm working on right now. I'm kind of just at the very beginning stages. I'm looking at resettlement from Japanese American incarceration camps in World War II, and I'm really interested in kind of the experience and category of aliens, since all Japanese technically were considered enemy aliens, at least at the start of the war. And then, of course, Japanese migrants still couldn't naturalize until 1952. So they're aliens, they're alienized, and they're incarcerated. But they're also, what I'm interested in is that resettlement period too, because during that period, resettlement sort of programs were meant to sort of root them in communities all over the country, right? So you could leave the incarceration camps really as early as summer of 1942. So months after people were herded into these camps, people began at least to trickle out. And there was a whole set of programs led by the federal government, but partnered with private, public, state, local organizations all over the country that were meant to kind of essentially assimilate, these resettlers into these communities all over the country. There was Cold War pressures. There's obviously war pressures because the United States felt a lot of pressure because, undertaking this obviously undemocratic program of incarcerating 120,000 people. And so resettlement was a way to kind of dig themselves out of that grave by saying well, we had to incarcerate them, but really that's just the start of kind of dispersing them throughout the country and integrating them into mainstream society and helping them become fuller Americans than they could have been before. So resettlement that sort of created these, what I call this kind of form of alien belonging, ways of structures, support for crafting forms of local belonging, even though that kind of belied in some ways their political or legal status. It's obviously, it wasn't done out of the goodness of the state's heart, but but what it sort of, I think, helped to create this kind of model that we could look to even now, right? We're struggling with, what do we do with refugees and asylum seekers? How do we treat Muslim religious minorities, right? What do we do with aliens in our country or trying to come into our country? And I think this is an example of a time in which aliens were kind of purposefully integrated in very careful and limited ways, but nonetheless that might be kind of instructive in some ways, as both cautionary but also kind of instructive for us today.
Monica, can I just end on a comment before you close? Just because I've been so involved with the sister city relationship, and the sister city relationship between Japan and San Francisco for a long time on an upper level was really a white relationship with Osaka. The Japanese American community was involved in cultural ways and individual relationships, and it really wasn't until the 1990s that Japanese Americans really started to play a role on a higher level between the two cities from a board and association level. And so for the most part, now we are very influential in terms of controlling the narrative between our two cities, where you would think it'd be natural, but for a long time it was more the lawyers, the bankers, all those people who were on the sister city board. But interesting, my last comment is, you can stand anywhere in San Francisco and ask 100 people who our sister city is in Japan, and maybe one person might know. More likely they don't know. But you could go to Japan and well over 50% or more, if you ask who is the sister city in the United States, they know it's San Francisco. Even the cab drivers know. Really interesting about valuing the relationship or education about who our sister cities are. But I want to thank you for your input on that, because it's really an untouched, unknown subject for many people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all for your questions and participation.
Haruka, you just want to close with the next program series or part 2?
Sure. All right. So yes, thank you, Dr. This was a fascinating presentation, and certainly provided so much more information than I think many of us were ever aware of. So thank you so much for that. And as we mentioned throughout the program, we do have another lecture with you coming up next month, and that will be May 20th. The subject of next month's lecture is Japanese Americans and African Americans in Western Addition redevelopment. So certainly that's going to touch upon some of the questions that were asked tonight and provide a little bit more insight, especially between the relationship between our two communities here in the Western Addition. So with that, I just really want to thank everyone for sticking with us tonight. I know we went a little bit longer than we anticipated, but because you guys had such great questions to ask, and Dr. Oda had so much more information to share with us. So with that being said, we hope that you guys sign up for next month's lecture, and we will see you next month. Thank you so much.